pick up the two specifics that were addressed. So on plausibility, practical challenges, of course every practical challenge is solvable. The question is, what are the incentives that are introduced into the system by that solution? So I wouldn't say it's impossible to do what Stern. I definitely wouldn't want you to quote me on that. But it is possible to do it, but it may introduce some effects that we're not expecting. So one of the challenges is that what Stern says, and it's quite a sensible point, is that the institution where the research is carried out is the one that should get the output. But how do you define that when scholarship is an extended activity that will cut across the moves that people make between institutions? So I think it's how you define that, and you can choose some arbitrary points to define that. You can choose, you could say the point of acceptance of a publication tells you that the research was done at that institution. But the minute you do that, you get into really challenging territory. So I've had anecdotes given to me of humanities scholars in particular who might get write a book proposal, get that book accepted, spend several years writing that book, then it goes for publication, and then there's a period of delay before that. And that might extend over a decade easily, and could have 2 or 3 moves between institutions within that period. So that it becomes quite challenging in terms of how you implement that. So that's the kind of thing I had in mind. Qualitative feedback to the panels, from the panels. There is some qualitative feedback given. So the panels write, they do 2 things. They write a public overview report, which talks about the strengths and weaknesses of their field, and that information is provided back. And then they do provide confidential feedback to individual institutions as well on the performance of individual units. So that feedback is provided. Personally, I tend to agree with you that there's maybe more we could do on that, but the counter-argument is that panel members want assurance that their decisions won't be crawled over in huge amounts of detail after the event. And I think this does link to the way in which we link quite large amounts of funding to the decision. So it becomes quite high stakes and quite difficult for that. And to your question about using networks, I think there's huge potential there. I think there's some fascinating work going on looking at the bibliometric network and using semantic analysis to try and trace the development of ideas through that network. I think the challenge we have is that that's probably a bit early for the next exercise. And one of the things I think is really important is that we have a future, we really have a forward look and think about how we might use new technologies like network analysis in the one after next. Yeah.
And I mean, just on that before coming to it, I mean, it's worth mentioning, Stephen and I have just come, inviting others in the room, from the inaugural meeting of the new UK Forum for Responsible Research Metrics, which has been set up partly as a implementation of a recommendation of the Metric Tide report, but partly with exactly this function to be more of a institutional space in which the UK public funding system at least can look ahead and anticipate and think through some of the new and varied technical as well as policy and social opportunities coming down the track, which would include this kind of stuff. But I have to say, from my perspective, having looked at it in the immediate context of the ref, I'm very much with Stephen that it would have been premature to go to that for ref. It's going to be challenging enough to deal with all that Stern has put in front of us. But Gunnar, you wanted to come in.
Yes, it was in this specific question of portability of outputs. Seen from outside, Britain, UK has a very particular mobility pattern with intervals that we don't have in the other countries. And this is also described as a problem in the Stern report. And they suggest, this is why, as you know, they suggest that output should not be portable. Now, what can it mean if there is an alternative? There are norms and rules of giving credit to institutions and funding organizations when you do scholarly publishing. And of course, without evaluation systems, those norms would exist and be rational. They are also possible to gain. But I've seen countries establishing norms supporting those scholarly norms by agreement between institutions. So this means that the objective source of information of where a publication should be affiliated, it can be divided, of course, between institutions, is by using the affiliations published in the publication. And then the agreements between the institutions in the country support the researchers in using their knowledge about how their own work should be affiliated and credited in the publication. Then you also have a kind of objective information to take that from.
Did you also want to say anything about Woody's point on other ways of measuring social network analysis?
Certainly. I think that big data, new data, also data on how we are acting every day, provide so rich new data sources. We haven't come too far yet. So in the altmetrics movement, we are using social media to explore societal impact. Now, I think being social is different from being societal. The transfer of knowledge to society happens in many other channels than social media. But I'd like to see our day-to-day emailing addresses, for example, in an analysis of real networks. But this is more the future, and perhaps there are obstacles. But I agree that we should look at other opportunities for measuring real impact, also within and outside academia.
Gemma, you wanted to come in on this as well?
I've got something, I guess, to say about two points. I'd first like to address the iteration that panels can be gained and what that means for peer-reviewed panels. Thank you. The theories of peer review means that there are a group of people who take collective responsibility for the decision. That is the evaluation outcome. The theory is that if you introduce a couple of people with biases or tendencies, there will be enough people on the panel with alternative or contrasting bias and tendencies to even it out. And that's the theory. Of course, it doesn't happen all right? But I think that if you try to map people's specific personality biases before they go into a decision and try to control for that, you kind of take away from the beauty of a peer review expert-driven decision making. So yes, it can be done, but I don't necessarily think that you can or should try to legislate against that type of gaming because it's so diverse, it's so subtle. I think that perhaps if we're talking about perverse incentives, that trying to reduce that type of gaming in a group situation is only going to lead to more severe consequences. I think that the REF 2014 evaluators were extremely brave. And we've been talking about the REF, 14, and is the UK leading or lagging? And I think that perhaps some credit needs to be given to the individual evaluators who took on this criterion, that they didn't know what to do, and they told me they didn't know what to do. They referred to themselves as impact virgins, and yes, they were. They had no idea what to do. They were incredibly brave to do this, but they had enough faith that they were quite aware that different points of view would be brought into the evaluation panel, but they were quite assured that would be evened out in the move through the strength of committee culture, through the fact that these different biases, those ones who are willing to game the system, would necessarily be balanced by those ones who wouldn't, and that somehow this would develop a committee culture or a dominant definition that would guide the evaluation, provide a lens. So I don't think that trying to control for that is something that perhaps we should work towards. Peer review works. It doesn't necessarily create the same, every different peer review panel doesn't create the same outcome, but that's not how we measure its success. So perhaps we should do it. Well, I'm a little bit qualitative on that point, so I think there's lies and statistics anyway. Can I just add on my second point, and I think it needs to be said because I am the only female of this panel and I'm also the only one without a professor before my name, about portability. Well, I assume Stephen's a professor. I mean, he's Stephen. I think with all these considerations about portability, and I've said this before in articles that I've written and commentary that I've said, that the voice of younger female academics who are trying to break into a system, that it's phenomenally difficult. Do you know how difficult this is? We don't need anything more stacking against us. For me, the stern recommendation that portability should stop was akin to a Nobel Prize winner giving me advice, who won a Nobel Prize based on, publishing an article in Nature, giving me the advice that I shouldn't publish in Nature because it's wrong. It's like, yeah, well, great, you're a professor now, you can make those decisions. Portability is an extremely important bargaining tool that we younger researchers have. And I think that the Stern Review, with its panel of experts and talking back on peer review panels and the voices that are heard within those panels, every single member of those people had benefited from a system that had promoted their publications as their own rather than related to an institution. And I think that needs to be said, because it's the only thing we have to bargain our salaries, which are always low. It's the only thing we have to do to bargain our position. And the mobility that we have is the only tool that we have to promote ourselves in a phenomenally difficult system to crack. So I'm sorry, but that's probably the most controversial thing I'll say all day. But it needs to be said by the only non-professor on the panel.
No, it's fair. I mean, I made the same point in my review of the Stern Review. I thought it was an oversight. Whatever we think about the technical question of non-portability, it was a shame that there was no one on the Stern group. And it comes back to this issue about group dynamics and the composition of panels that would have immediately grasped the very different perspective you have on this question if you're in a more precarious position in the system than if you're a well-established. I mean, most of that panel were not, even ordinary jobbing professors. They were vice chancellors and presidents of various eminent learned societies. So they were on an even higher plane, if that's the correct way to think about it, which it isn't, as Cameron will remind us.
Well, I was going to say, I did touch on a few things here. One is when we're talking about evaluation and consistency/reliability of evaluation, what we're talking about is constructing communities. And I think the point about how that feedback, how the experience and evaluation occurs, and how that's fed back into the community. I don't think we think enough about this, what we're doing to structure communities in the process of these evaluations, and how we can construct communities of evaluation. And we'll need various of those as we go forward. I think in that context, it's kind of, I'm going to have my scientist card taken away from me at this point. But I find it interesting, the idea that there is a right answer that a panel would come to. I'm not sure that even makes sense. The answer the panel comes to is the answer the panel comes to. We can critique the process, we can critique the membership. And indeed, Michelle Lamont, in her book on grant panels in North America, makes the point that actually the program officers within the funder wield a lot of hidden power through the choices they get to make about who's appointed and brought into panels over time. But I think it's an interesting assumption. Again, it's a very scientific assumption that there is a correct answer. I think actually it's very freeing to get away from that. This is a process, it comes to an answer, the answer is accepted or not, it does or does not adhere to a process and set of best practices that we set out. But it is what it is. It's not, there is no right answer in the end for these complicated resource allocations. And then just finally, I think there's actually something that's really cheering about this. And Parche, the career researcher thing and portability, because I think that's the really big issue. But actually what we're talking about here, what we're quibbling about with Stern, is largely about how these changes might perturb an existing equilibrium. We're not getting really upset about the fundamentals, about what's trying to be reformed. I think that's something we should really grab a hold of. And so that's telling us something about the system being embedded and respected in a way that I think most academics 15 years ago would have struggled to believe would ever happen. In the departments I was in around 2000s. I think we've made a lot of progress.
Thank you. Gemma, you wanted to quickly come back on that?
Yes, I definitely. I think I just want to elaborate a little bit more what Cameron said, and especially because I'm the biggest fan of Michelle Lamont's How Professors Think, as well as Liv Langfeld, who's a colleague of Gunner's as well. All of her work. I mean, I guess this was one thing I said. It's not about getting a better decision, because there is no right or wrong decision now. I mean, the strength of peer review is in the fact of the process itself, and the fact that it is assumed to be an expert-driven process. There are hidden powers and criteria, however, in directing the discussions or the evaluation based on certain criteria. And when we talk about where we're heading, I mean, those criteria basically personify what we want out of our research system. And so societal impact, we want research to have an impact away from academia, as well as within academia, but we want our institutions to be excellent. And the funny thing is that all these tiny little changes, you know, do we do portability this way? Do we control who's being put on the panels as a way of counteracting gaming, etc.? It might like to say that the diversity of the panel membership was actually evaluated after the panel membership was established, if I can remember. So, you know, this might necessarily need changing. But you did have a very good gender balance, it's true. But all of these tiny things, well, it depends how loud their voices are. Mine would be very loud. All these tiny little things are about trying to avoid some sort of perverse incentive or trying to avoid some aspect of gaming, as if this system of evaluation can be cheated. You can cheat within it. But peer review and evaluation processes, because we're not about defining whether it's a better evaluation decision or not, or whether it works smarter, which is what I try to do, by definition, you can't cheat that system. So all these tiny things that are trying to guard against some form of unfairness or cheating is perhaps trying to stop people gaming a situation that they really have no control over. So I think that perhaps we should move the argument away from perverse incentives and trying to this idea that somehow by somebody gaming the system they're going to have an unfair advantage. It goes into this black box, it moves around, and we want that box to remain black. We can set guidelines, etc., going into that box, but what happens in that box can't be gamed by its very nature. And that's beautiful, and I think that's why the ref is lagging. As Gunnar said, other Nordic countries use metrics-driven, and they don't use peer review. Here we use peer review, and it's the strength of the system, and because of that, it can't be gamed. And that's why we're leading. That's why we're leading. And this is an Australian saying, the UK is leading. Viva la Repubblica.
Netherlands is typical for European countries. It's not very particular. I call it not metrics-based, but indicator-based. And they have these several indicators. They are quantitative, and they go into the quantitative numbers for funding. So it's part of a funding formula, which also takes into considerations what the authorities want to do with the universities. There's some strategic thinking, okay. And there's a dialogue with the universities, and they are supposed to evaluate themselves with intervals, but the result of the evaluation is not part of the funding formula. So this is the case in most European countries, that the institutional funding formula is made relatively simple and based on open information that is already there on the activities. And then the quality of the institutional work in education is more handled in dialogue with institutions and in evaluations that do not have direct influence on the institutional funding. And of course, the second stream and the balance between the streams becomes more important when you do it simple for the institutional funding. So Netherlands is typical and not very special.
Great. And then our other three speakers' responses to Martin's challenge. A REF or it was a RAF, was it? A resource allocation framework. A REF or a RAF. What would be different?
I guess I'm struck by the fact that you could just change the name, and that would make massive difference without changing anything else at all. It would suddenly, and I guess which is, was the point. In some ways, a much more effective way of making the point I tried to do in my 8 minutes. What we call these things matters, and how they play out matters. I've been struck in a different context recently by the fact that we do three things and we tend to disconnect them in quite disturbing ways. So one is the partitioning of responsibilities, who's responsible for doing certain things. The second is who is doing well at whatever it is they're supposed to be doing. And then the third is actually the resource allocation. And very frequently, these things don't actually connect up, or you get two, as in to Gunnar's point, we've connected two in a particular way in the UK, and that creates a particular structure, a particular set of systems, which largely emphasises a fairly British Anglo-American culture of research. I don't have an answer, but it's a very good question.
Gemma?
Still thinking. No. I guess this comes back to whether we do this on an individual level basis or whether we do this on an institutional. And I'm going to say something that's probably going to freak everyone out. But it's because of my department. Yeah, don't worry. If we're looking at resource evaluation framework for universities, perhaps my question would be, what do you evaluate and who does the evaluation? And what potential there is for those evaluations to challenge what we think, where the resources should go, the Oxbridge, Dorking triangle, whether we're going to fund the north and the south, and perhaps a resource allocation funding might be a little bit more even in that regard. But there are problems with that system. We've seen that in Italy and Spain that has that kind of system. A resource allocation framework, you've taken the evaluation out of it, so there goes my job. But perhaps if we put the research allocation evaluation framework, maybe we put the TEF and the REF together. Would be an interesting way of encompassing an evaluation framework, exactly what we want out of our universities. And perhaps, that would have other perverse effects on teaching research staff responsibilities, etc. I can understand in theory it would be more robust, but I guess I problematize these kinds of things for a living, so I'd be interested to see what sort of follow-on effects it would have. It would make your job a lot harder.
Or Stephen, to end.
So I'm going to pick up on the comment that Saba made and Cameron made in his opening comments about, should we actually be separating research outputs and impact in terms of our evaluation? And actually, the article that I've written for the Palgrave Special Edition, so it's my chance for a plug, argues that we should at least be having a much higher proportion of the assessment around societal impact and less on research outputs. That's a controversial view, and that's certainly not a hefty view, because the hefty view is that we're implementing Stern, and Stern was very, very clear on this point, that the outputs percentage should be no lower than 65%. The hands of the funding bodies are now tied by that, and we are limited as to how we move around. So I kind of agree with that point. I think it does start to speak to Martin's question, which I'm afraid I'm going to answer in a slightly boring way. Sorry. But I think we do, try and keep a very clear separation between the process of evaluation and the allocation of resources. And the reason for that is partly a very practical one in the UK context, in that we evaluate UK-wide, and the decisions about funding allocation and how that data is used to make funding allocations are made at a national level. So we make those decisions for England, and so the processes do have to be separate. And I think there are separate sets of decisions. So decisions about how you want to distribute funding, how much you want to reward higher quality versus a more even distribution of funding. Those are separate policy decisions and discussions from questions about how you go about the evaluation. What's important in the evaluation, and will be, I think, a big debate in the consultation we're about to have, is how discriminatory do you want that evaluation to be? Because the discrimination of the evaluation gives you your maximum discrimination that you can have in terms of your funding policy. You could choose, you could say, well, we've now got this wonderful ranking of universities with strong discrimination, but we're going to give them all the same amount of money. That policy choice is available to you, but the opposite policy choice, no, we've ranked them all the same, but we want to give them different amounts of money, that option isn't there. So that's the way that things are linked, and I think we do have to think very carefully about the discrimination processes and whether we're getting enough discrimination to give ourselves the policy flexibility to change the way in which we allocate resources. So that's a kind of boring answer, but they are linked, but I think it's important to try and keep those ideas separate as well. Sorry.
Great. Well, thank you all very much. Thank you for your questions. We will, of course, wait to see the technical consultation when it comes out in the next few days. I mean, as Stephen has been talking about this on various platforms in recent weeks, and have at times, albeit in a rather cringy way, talked about soft stern and hard stern in terms of
Stern means stern.
black, white, red, white, and blue stern. No, I haven't. I mean, it links to Stephen's final point in that confronted with some of these technical complexities in carrying forward both the spirit and the letter of Stern's recommendations, there's going to be an interesting tussle in the sector as many institutions or mission groups and others will push things back to closer to Ref 14 because that's the framework we just did and people know how it works even though it's not perfect, and it sort of gets you round some of these more thorny issues. The intention, of course, in the Stern Review is that it is implemented as a package, and its full effects don't really, occur if you sort of cherry pick and only do some of it and not all of it. So this is one of a number of sort of axes of debate to watch over the next 14 weeks and inevitably beyond. But thank you to all of you for coming, for your questions and contributions to what I think has been a very rich and certainly for me interesting discussion. We would encourage you to continue keeping an eye on the Palgrave Comms collection as it builds and accrues additional contributions in the months ahead. If any of you who are here would like to contribute, do, as Gino said at the start, speak either to him or to me about that. We'd very much welcome additional papers in the mix. But for now, please do stay, join us for a drink, a glass of wine, and we were going to ask you to evaluate tonight in a light touch 3-part questionnaire, the outputs, the impact that tonight will have over the next 5 to 10 years of your career, and of course the environment, the discussion environment that we've the environment that we've created here this evening. But we've decided to drop that and instead have a drink. So before we go, thanks again to our 4 panelists, to Stephen, to Gemma, to Cameron, and to Gunnar for a really interesting evening. Thank you.